September 3, 1942, Allegheny Munitions Plant, Pittsburgh. A young factory worker stands at Station 47, her hands moving through the same motion for the 8,000th time that shift, inspecting brass shell casings one by one. Around her, 3,000 workers perform similar tasks, their efficiency supposedly optimized by professional engineers with advanced degrees. But she's been watching the production line for months, and she's seen something they've all missed, something so obvious it seems impossible that nobody else has noticed it. The inefficiency she's identified is costing them 30% of their production capacity, and somewhere across the Atlantic, soldiers are rationing bullets because the factories back home can't keep up. She's about to do something that will either get her promoted or fired. She's going to walk into the plant manager's office and tell him that his engineers got it wrong. What could one factory girl possibly see that experienced engineers overlooked? And how could a simple observation change the entire course of ammunition production in World War II? The answer would arm an entire army and prove that innovation doesn't care about your education or position, only about whether you're paying attention. September 3, 1942, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Allegheny Munitions Plant hummed with the sound of 1,000 machines working in desperate harmony, each one churning out the bullets and shells that would keep Allied soldiers alive across 2 oceans. The smell of hot metal and machine oil hung thick in the air, mixing with the sweat of workers who had been on their feet for 12 hours straight, and the factory floor stretched out like a mechanical cathedral, row after row of assembly lines producing the instruments of war with methodical precision. Margaret Hayes stood at Station 47, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same motion 8,000 times in a single shift, picking up the brass casing, inspecting it for defects, passing it down the line, picking up another, her fingers already reaching before her eyes had finished checking the one before. She was 23 years old, though the war had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time, her dark hair tied back under a faded blue kerchief, her coveralls stained with oil and brass dust that never quite washed out, no matter how hard she scrubbed in the boarding house bathroom each night. The other women on her line worked with the same mechanical rhythm, their faces set in expressions of concentration that bordered on exhaustion, because production quotas had been increased again last week, and Foreman Davidson had made it very clear that failure to meet them would be considered unpatriotic, which was just another way of saying you'd be fired and someone else would take your place before you made it to the factory gates. Margaret had been working at Allegheny for 14 months now, ever since her husband Robert shipped out with the sea, and she'd learned the unspoken rules of factory life pretty quickly. Keep your head down, don't complain, don't suggest changes to the process no matter how obvious the improvements might be, and absolutely never challenge the engineers who designed the systems or the foremen who enforced them. But today something was different, something that had been gnawing at her for weeks as she watched the endless stream of shell casings move past her station, an inefficiency so glaring that she couldn't understand why nobody else seemed to see it or care. The line moved in sections, with casings traveling from the brass stamping area to the inspection station where Margaret stood, then to the powder filling station, then to the primer insertion area, then to final inspection before being packed into wooden crates for shipping. The problem was in the transition between stations, where workers had to physically pick up each casing and pass it to the next station, a motion that seemed simple enough until you multiplied it by thousands of units and hundreds of workers, and Margaret had calculated in her head that at least 30% of their time was spent just moving the casings from one place to another instead of actually working on them. She'd mentioned it once to her line supervisor, a pinch-faced woman named Miss Yawarski, who had immediately shut her down with a lecture about how the engineers knew what they were doing and factory girls should stick to their assigned tasks. But the thought wouldn't leave her alone, especially when she heard the radio reports about ammunition shortages on the front lines and knew that somewhere across the ocean her husband might be rationing bullets because they couldn't make them fast enough back home. The afternoon shift change whistle blew it through a shrill sound that cut through the machine noise and signaled the arrival of the evening crew who would take over until midnight, and as Margaret stepped away from her station, she flexed her hands, trying to work, feeling back into fingers that had gone numb from repetitive motion. The break room was packed with women peeling off their work gloves and lighting cigarettes, their conversations a mix of complaints about sore feet and gossip about who was dating which soldier on leave, but Margaret barely heard them as she sat in the corner with her packed lunch, her mind still turning over the problem of the assembly line like a dog worrying a bone. The truth was she had an idea, something so simple it seemed almost stupid, but every time she ran through the numbers in her head the math worked out, and if she was right, if her calculations were even close to accurate, they could increase output by at least 50%, maybe more, without adding a single worker or machine to the floor. The question wasn't whether the idea would work, it was whether anyone would listen to a factory girl who barely graduated high school and had been told her entire life that her job was to follow instructions, not think of better ones. Margaret unwrapped her sandwich, the bread slightly stale from sitting in her lunch pail all morning, and watched the other women laughing and sharing cigarettes, and she wondered if any of them ever thought about the bigger picture, ever stayed awake at night doing calculations on scraps of paper, ever felt like they were watching a machine run inefficiently and wanted to scream at everyone to just see what she was seeing. Her best friend Dottie slid into the seat across from her, a redhead with a quick smile and a husband in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific, and she immediately launched into a story about her supervisor making a pass at her near the supply closet, but Margaret only half listened, her mind already moving forward to what she needed to do next, who she needed to talk to, how she could possibly get anyone to take her serious. The war wouldn't wait for bureaucracy and hierarchy and the unspoken rule that women didn't challenge the men who designed the systems they worked within, and somewhere in France or North Africa or Italy, soldiers were fighting with limited ammunition because nobody at the Allegheny Munitions Plant would listen to a girl with grease under her fingernails and numbers scribbled in the margins of her work orders. Margaret finished her sandwich in 3 bites, drank the lukewarm coffee from her thermos, and made a decision that would either get her promoted or fired, and right now she didn't particularly care which it was, because doing nothing while people died for lack of bullets wasn't something she could live with anymore, not when the solution was so obvious it made her teeth hurt. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The news spread through Allegheny Munitions like wildfire, workers abandoning their stations to gather around radios, and Margaret stood with the Line C crew listening to the announcement that Germany had surrendered, that the war in Europe was over, and she felt relief and joy, mixed with the knowledge that it wasn't finished yet, that the Pacific War continued and that soldiers like Robert were still in danger, still needed the ammunition they produced. The factory celebrated that night with a party in the main assembly hall, workers and management mingling together in rare quality, sharing food and drinks and stories, and Margaret found herself surrounded by women who'd become more than just co-workers, who'd become friends and comrades, through 18 months of shared labor and purpose. 3 months later, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs demonstrated a new kind of warfare that made conventional ammunition almost quaint by comparison, and this time the celebration was different, more complete, because now it was truly over, and the boys were coming home and everything could finally return to normal, though nobody was quite sure what normal meant anymore. The letters from Robert had stopped after VA Day, because military postal service had descended into chaos with millions of soldiers being demobilized and shipped stateside, and Margaret had spent those silent weeks alternating between hope and worry, checking the casualty lists published in newspapers, writing letters that might never reach him, waiting for confirmation that he'd survived not just the war, but the dangerous period after, when accidents and disease killed soldiers who'd survived combat. The telegram arrived in August, brief and official, informing her that Robert was alive and well and scheduled to return to the United States in September, and Margaret had stood in her boarding house room holding that thin piece of paper, and cried with relief so profound it made her knees weak. The Allegheny Munitions Plant began the transition to peacetime production, retooling lines for commercial goods, laying off workers who'd been essential during wartime but were now surplus to reduce needs, and Margaret watched as the workforce shrank from 5,000 to 3,000 to eventually just 1,200, watched as women who'd proven their capabilities on the factory floor were told their services were no longer needed, told to return to homes and traditional roles, thanked for their service and shown the door. She could have stayed. Davidson had made it clear that her position was secure, that her expertise in production efficiency would be valuable regardless of what the factory was manufacturing. But Margaret had decided months ago that when the war ended, she wanted something different, wanted to use what she'd learned in ways that weren't tied to a single factory or company. She'd been accepted to Carnegie Technical Schools to study industrial engineering, one of only a handful of women in the program, starting classes in January 1946, and the prospect terrified and excited her in equal measure. Robert's ship docked in New York on September, and Margaret took the train east to meet him, her hands clutching the handle of her small suitcase so tightly her knuckles went white. 20 months of separation about to end, and she wasn't sure if she was more afraid that he'd changed or that she had, that the people who'd lived through the war would be too different to recognize each other anymore. The reunion platform at Pennsylvania Station was chaos, hundreds of soldiers disembarking while hundreds of families waited, everyone scanning faces and searching through crowds, and Margaret stood on her toes trying to see over the mass of people, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might actually break through her ribs. Then she saw him, thinner than she remembered and older somehow despite being only 20, his uniform worn and his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, scanning the crowd with the same desperate intensity she felt, and their eyes met across 50 feet of crowded platform and everything else disappeared, all the noise and chaos and other people fading to background blur as they moved toward each other. They collided rather than embraced, arms wrapping tight enough to hurt, and Margaret buried her face in his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him. Different now, military soap and travel sweat, and something indefinably changed, but still him, still Robert, still the man she'd married a lifetime ago before the world went crazy. They stood there holding each other while people flowed around them, other reunions happening in parallel, a platform full of soldiers and families trying to pick up pieces of lives interrupted by 4 years of global conflict. And finally Robert pulled back enough to look at her properly, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face like he was memorizing every detail. He said she looked different, looked strong, looked like someone who'd been through her own kind of war. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time and told him he had no idea, that she had stories to tell him about factories and conveyor belts and how she'd accidentally become slightly famous for improving ammunition production, and Robert's face split into the grin she remembered, genuine and warm, and he said he'd heard rumors about that people in his unit had talked about the factory girl whose innovation had changed the war, but he'd never quite believed it was his Margaret they were talking about. They collected his duffel and found a diner near the station where they sat in a booth and talked for 4 hours straight, filling in the gaps that letters couldn't cover, and Margaret told him about the conveyor system and the crisis and the vindication, about General MacArthur and war bonds tours and studying engineering. Robert told her about combat and brotherhood and fear and the strange guilt of survival when so many others didn't make it, and they discovered that they were different people now, but maybe that was okay. Maybe growing apart and then choosing to grow back together was stronger than never changing at all. The train back to Pittsburgh left at midnight, and they rode through darkness watching farmland and small towns slide past the windows, Robert's head on her shoulder, his breathing deep and even, finally able to sleep without worrying about enemy attack or guard duty, and Margaret stayed awake watching him, still half afraid this was a dream that would evaporate if she closed her eyes. They arrived in Pittsburgh as dawn broke over the city, painting the steel mills and factories in shades of rose and gold, and Margaret thought about how this place had been her entire world for 20 months, how these streets and buildings contained the story of her transformation from assembly line worker to someone who'd helped change the course of a war, and how now she was ready for whatever came next. Robert squeezed her hand as the taxi pulled up to her boarding house, now their boarding house until they could find something more permanent, and he said he was proud of her, proud of what she'd accomplished, proud that she hadn't just waited for the war to end, but had actively worked to make it end fast. And Margaret felt tears threatening again because his pride meant more than medals or newspaper articles, or all the official recognition she'd received. The war was over, the soldiers were home, and the world was trying to figure out what came next. And Margaret Hayes stood on a Pittsburgh sidewalk at dawn with her husband's hand in hers, looking at a future that was uncertain but full of possibility, and she thought about conveyor belts and shell casings and all the small innovations that had added up to something larger than herself, and she knew that whatever challenges came next, she'd face them the same way she'd faced the problem of assembly line efficiency, by refusing to accept that good enough was actually good enough, by looking at systems others considered fixed and asking if they could be better, by having the courage to speak up even when nobody wanted to listen, and by remembering that ordinary people doing extraordinary work was how you changed the world one small improvement at a time. The night shift started at midnight, and Margaret had volunteered for it 3 weeks ago, despite the toll it took on her sleep schedule, because working from midnight to 8 in the morning meant fewer supervisors watching over your shoulder and more time to observe the production process without someone breathing down your neck about quotas and efficiency reports. The factory transformed after dark, the daytime chaos giving way to a different kind of rhythm, quieter, somehow despite the constant machine noise, the skeleton crew of workers moving through their stations like ghosts in a mechanical underworld, lit by harsh bulbs that cast everything in shades of yellow and shadow. Margaret had been using her breaks to walk the entire production line, notebook hidden in her coveralls pocket, sketching the layout and timing each stage of the process with her father's old pocket watch that she wore on a chain around her neck. And the more she studied the system, the more convinced she became that her idea wasn't just good, it was necessary, critical, the kind of improvement that could change the course of the war if anyone would just listen. The current setup required each worker to manually transfer shell casings between stations, a process that involved picking up the casing, turning to face the next station, walking 2 or 3 steps, placing the casing on the next work surface, then returning to pick up another one, and when you multiplied that motion by every worker on every line across 3 shifts, you were looking at thousands of wasted man-hours every single week. Margaret's idea was deceptively simple: install a continuous conveyor belt system that would carry the casings automatically from one station to the next, with workers positioned along the belt to perform their specific tasks as the casings moved past them, eliminating all the picking up and carrying and turning and walking that currently ate up so much time. The factory already had conveyor systems in the raw materials section and the shipping area, so the technology existed. It was just a matter of applying it to the assembly line itself, and Margaret had calculated that workers could probably triple their output if they didn't have to waste motion on transportation. The problem was getting anyone to listen to her, let alone take her idea seriously enough to actually implement it, because the factory operated on a strict hierarchy, where engineers designed systems, foremen implemented them, and workers followed orders, and suggesting changes to that hierarchy was about as welcome as suggesting they stop producing ammunition altogether. Margaret finished her inspection of the 3rd assembly line and checked her watch, noting that it was 2:47 a.m., and the morning supervisor wouldn't arrive until 6, which gave her almost 3 hours to continue her observations, and she moved quietly through the factory floor, her work boots making soft sounds against the concrete, past the other night shift workers who were too focused on their own tasks to pay attention to her wandering. She ended up in the shipping area, watching the forklift operators load crates of finished ammunition onto trucks bound for ports on both coasts, and she thought about how each one of those crates represented countless hours of labor and materials and coordination, all to keep soldiers supplied with the means to fight, and how heartbreaking it was that they could be doing so much more if the people in charge would just be willing to listen to someone who wasn't an engineer or a manager. The forklift driver, a barrel-chested man named Frank who had to be at least 6, noticed her watching and called out asking if she was lost, and Margaret told him she was just on break, curious about how the shipping operation worked, and Frank seemed pleased to have someone interested in his domain, launching into an explanation of how the logistics worked, how the trucks had to be loaded in a specific order, based on where their cargo was headed, how timing was everything, because a delay of even a few hours could mean soldiers waiting for supplies. Margaret listened and asked questions, and somewhere in the conversation she mentioned her observations about the assembly line, half expecting Frank to dismiss her the way everyone else had, but instead he got quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly and said that actually made a lot of sense, that the Navy had started using continuous conveyor systems on their supply ships, and it had cut loading times by more than half. They talked for 20 minutes, Margaret's break stretching longer than it should, and when she finally headed back to her station, she felt a small spark of validation, because if a forklift driver could see the merit in her idea, then maybe, just maybe, she wasn't crazy for thinking it could work. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of repetitive motion, her hands working automatically while her mind ran through calculations and scenarios, trying to figure out how to present her idea in a way that wouldn't immediately get her dismissed as an upstart factory girl who didn't know her place. She'd heard stories about other workers who had suggested improvements, most of them men from the machine shop who had been laughed out of the supervisor's office, or quietly transferred to less desirable positions, and the message was clear: keep your mouth shut and do your job. Innovation comes from the top down, not the bottom up. But Margaret couldn't shake the image of her husband and his fellow soldiers running out of ammunition in some muddy trench while she stood at her station passing shell casings one at a time like it was 90, and she knew that if she didn't at least try to make someone listen, she'd regret it for the rest of her life. The shift ended at 8 a.m. with another shrill whistle, and Margaret collected her lunch pail and headed for the time clock with the other night shift workers, their faces grey with exhaustion in the early morning light filtering through the factory's high window. She punched out and walked to the bus stop through streets still quiet before the morning rush, and sitting on the bench waiting for the bus that would take her back to her boarding house, she pulled out her notebook and reviewed her calculations one more time, making sure the numbers added up, because she'd decided overnight that she was going to take her idea to plant manager himself, and if that got her fired then so be it, at least she would have tried. Plant manager Theodore Morrison's office was on the third floor of the administration building, a space that seemed impossibly clean compared to the factory floor, with polished wooden furniture and windows that actually let in sunlight instead of the dim artificial glow that Margaret had grown accustomed to during her shifts. She stood outside the door for a full minute before knocking, her notebook clutched in both hands, rehearsing her opening lines in her head, while trying to ignore the voice that told her this was a terrible idea that would probably end with her looking for a new job. Morrison's secretary, a thin woman with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every kind of foolishness the world had to offer, had been deeply skeptical when Margaret showed up asking for an appointment, pointing out that plant workers didn't generally meet with the plant manager and that any concerns should go through the proper channels, starting with her line supervisor. But Margaret had persisted, explaining that she had an idea for improving production efficiency, and something in her tone, or maybe just the desperation in her eyes, had convinced the secretary to check the schedule and find a 15-minute slot at 9 a.m. on Friday, which was now, which was why Margaret was standing outside this door fighting the urge to turn around and forget the whole thing. She knocked 3 sharp raps that sounded louder than she intended, and heard a gruff voice call out for her to enter, and she pushed open the door and stepped into Theodore Morrison's domain. He was exactly what she'd expected, a man in his 50s with thinning hair combed carefully over his scalp, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a prominent nose, wearing a dark suit despite the factory heat, his desk covered with blueprints and production reports and all the paperwork that came with running a facility that employed 3,000 people across 3 shifts. He looked up from whatever he was reading, his expression mildly annoyed at the interruption, and gestured for Margaret to sit in the chair across from his desk without bothering with pleasantries or introductions. Margaret sat, setting her notebook on her lap, and Morrison asked her what this was about, his tone making it clear that his time was valuable and she'd better not waste it. She took a breath and launched into a pitch, explaining her observations about the assembly line, the wasted motion involved in manual transfer between stations, her calculations about potential production increases if they implemented a continuous conveyor system, and she spoke quickly because she knew she only had a few minutes to make her case before he dismissed her. Morrison listened without interrupting, his face giving away nothing, and when she finished there was a long silence during which he simply stared at her, and Margaret felt her confidence crumbling under that steady gaze, wondering if she'd just talked herself out of a job. Then he asked her how long she'd been working at the plant, and she told him 14 months, and he asked if she had any engineering training, and she admitted she didn't, just a high school education and 14 months of watching the production process, and he nodded slowly like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Morrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in that way men do when they're about to deliver bad news, wrapped ad condescension, and he explained that the current assembly line design had been created by professional engineers with advanced degrees and years of experience, that every aspect of the process had been carefully calculated and optimized, and that while he appreciated her enthusiasm, implementing the kind of changes she was suggesting would require a massive investment in equipment and retooling that the company simply couldn't afford right now. Margaret felt her stomach sink, but she pushed forward anyway, pulling out her notebook and showing him the calculations she'd made, the time studies she'd conducted during her breaks, the projected increases in output, and she pointed out that conveyor systems were already in use in other parts of the factory, so the technology wasn't unproven or experimental. Morrison glanced at her notebook but didn't really look at it, and he said something about how she didn't understand the bigger picture, the budget constraints, the approval process that would be required for such significant changes, and besides, the current system was meeting production quotas even if it wasn't perfect. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp, and she heard herself saying that meeting quotas wasn't the same as maximizing production, that soldiers were dying because they didn't have enough ammunition, that her husband was somewhere in Europe right now, possibly under fire while they wasted time with inefficient processes, because nobody wanted to admit that maybe, just maybe, a factory worker might see something that engineers missed. Morrison's expression hardened, and he told her that he understood she was worried about her husband, that they all had loved ones in harm's way, but that didn't give her the right to waltz into his office and suggest that the engineers and managers who had been running this facility long before she arrived didn't know what they were doing. The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret realized she'd crossed the line, let her emotions get the better of her professionalism, and she was about to apologize when Morrison stood up, signaling that the meeting was over, and he said he appreciated her dedication but that she should focus on her assigned tasks and leave the engineering decisions to the engineer. Margaret stood as well, gathering her notebook, feeling the weight of failure settling on her shoulders, and she was halfway to the door when Morrison said something that stopped her cold. He mentioned that there was a war production board inspector scheduled to visit the plant next week, someone from Washington tasked with identifying ways to increase output at critical facilities, and if she was so confident in her idea, maybe she should present it to him instead. The words could have been dismissive, a way of getting rid of her by passing her off to someone else, but Margaret caught something in Morrison's tone, a hint of curiosity or maybe challenge, like he was testing her to see if she'd actually follow through. She turned back, met his eyes, and asked for the inspector's name and when exactly he'd be visiting, and Morrison told her his name was Collins, that he'd be here Wednesday afternoon, and that she was welcome to try her luck with him, though he doubted it would go any better than this meeting. Margaret thanked him, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and left the office before he could change his mind or add any more discouraging commentary. And as she walked back toward the factory floor, she felt something shifting inside her, the disappointment giving way to a new sense of purpose, because Theodore Morrison might have dismissed her, but he'd also given her another chance, and this time she was going to make damn sure she was ready. Margaret spent the next 5 days living on coffee and determination, working her regular shifts at the factory, while using every spare moment to refine her proposal for the War Production Board inspector. Her boarding house room became a war room of sorts, the small desk buried under pages of calculations and sketches, her walls decorated with diagrams of the assembly line drawn on butcher paper that she'd bought at the corner store, every surface covered with notes scrawled in her careful handwriting. She'd never made a formal presentation before, had never had to convince someone in authority that her ideas had merit, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her as she worked through the nights, double-checking her math, and trying to anticipate every possible objection that Inspector Collins might raise. The other women in the boarding house thought she'd gone slightly mad, working herself to exhaustion over something that would probably end in disappointment, but Margaret's friend Dottie brought her sandwiches and coffee and didn't ask too many questions, understanding that sometimes you had to chase an idea, even if the odds were stacked against you. Margaret started with the time studies, going back over the notes she'd taken during her night shift wanderings and organizing them into clear data that showed exactly how much time workers spent on transportation versus actual assembly work, and the numbers were even worse than she'd initially calculated, with some stations spending up to 40% of their time just moving casings around. She sketched out a proposed conveyor system, drawing on what she'd observed in other parts of the factory, and what Frank the forklift driver had told her about the Navy's supply ship innovations, designing a continuous belt that would run the length of each assembly line, with workers positioned at fixed stations to perform their specific tasks as the casings moved past. The beauty of the system was its simplicity. Instead of worker A picking up a casing, inspecting it, walking to worker B's station and handing it over, then walking back to pick up another casing, while worker B did the same thing with worker C, The casing would simply move along the belt while workers A, B, and C each performed their tasks in sequence without ever leaving their position. It would require an initial investment in conveyor equipment and some reconfiguration of the factory floor, but Margaret estimated the system could pay for itself in increased output within 3 months, maybe less if they really optimized the workflow. She practiced her presentation in the mirror, trying to project confidence and competence instead of the nervous energy that made her hands shake whenever she thought about actually standing in front of a government inspector and pitching her idea. Tuesday night she barely slept, lying in bed running through her pitch over and over, and Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of bright sunshine that felt inappropriate for how terrified she was. Margaret wore her cleanest coveralls to work, made sure her hair was neatly pinned under her kerchief, and carried her notebook and diagrams in a canvas bag that she kept close during her shift, checking the clock every few minutes as afternoon approached. Inspector Collins arrived at 2 p.m. according to the factory grapevine, a tall man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, accompanied by Theodore Morrison, and several engineers who were clearly not thrilled about having their processes scrutinized by someone from Washington. Margaret watched from her station as they made their way through the factory floor, Collins stopping occasionally to observe workers or examine equipment, his expression thoughtful and unreadable, and she felt her heart hammering against her ribs because this was it. This was her chance to actually make a difference. She'd arranged with her supervisor to take her break when Collins reached their section of the factory, and when the group finally arrived at the inspection stations, Margaret took a breath and approached them, her bag clutched in one hand, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and go back to her station before she embarrassed herself. Morrison saw her coming and his expression flickered with something that might have been resignation or possibly amusement, and he said something to Collins that Margaret couldn't hear, then gestured for her to join them. Margaret introduced herself, trying to keep her voice steady, and explained that she had some observations about production efficiency that she thought might be relevant to his assessment, and Collins looked mildly surprised but told her to go ahead. He was there to hear any and all ideas about increasing output. She launched into her presentation right there on the factory floor, spreading her diagrams on a nearby workbench while workers at adjacent stations pretended not to listen, and the engineers watched with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Margaret walked Collins through her time studies, showing him the calculations about wasted motion, and explaining her proposed conveyor system, and to his credit he actually listened, asking pointed questions about implementation costs and potential complications and whether she'd considered how the system would handle defective casings that needed to be pulled from the line. The engineers jumped in with objections, pointing out all the reasons why it wouldn't work, why the current system was actually optimal despite appearances, why making such significant changes would disrupt production in the short term, even if it increased output eventually, and Margaret found herself defending her idea against people with engineering degrees and decades of experience while standing in her greasy coveralls with machine oil under her fingernails. But something strange happened during that exchange. Collins kept coming back to her numbers, kept asking questions that suggested he was taking her seriously, kept looking at the diagrams with genuine interest, and gradually the tone shifted from dismissive to genuinely analytical. He asked if she'd be willing to write up a detailed proposal, something he could submit to the War Production Board for consideration, and Margaret said yes before she'd even fully processed the question, and Collins nodded and said he'd arrange for her to have access to the engineering office and whatever resources she needed to formalize her plan. Theodore Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but he didn't contradict the inspector, and the engineers exchanged glances that suggested they couldn't believe a factory girl had just gotten approval to essentially redesign their assembly line. Margaret felt dizzy with a combination of relief and terror, because now she actually had to deliver, had to prove that her idea wasn't just good in theory but could work in practice. And as Collins and his entourage moved on to the next section of the factory, she stood there clutching her diagrams and wondering what exactly she'd just gotten herself into. The transformation of Assembly Line C into a test case for Margaret's conveyor system began 3 weeks after her meeting with Inspector Collins, and those 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity that left her feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. The War Production Board had fast-tracked her proposal with a speed that shocked everyone at Allegheny Munitions, approving the conversion of one production line as a pilot program to evaluate the potential for factory-wide implementation, and suddenly Margaret found herself split between her regular duties and what amounted to a second job as a technical consultant on the project. The engineers who'd dismissed her idea were now forced to work with her, and their resentment was palpable, manifesting clipped responses and barely concealed eye rolls whenever she suggested modifications to their designs. Chief Engineer Harrington was particularly hostile, a man in his 60s who'd been designing industrial systems since before Margaret was born, and he made it clear in their meetings that he considered this entire exercise a waste of time and resources, that they were only proceeding because Washington had ordered it, and that when the system inevitably failed, he'd be the first one to submit his report explaining exactly why factory workers shouldn't be making engineering decisions. But Margaret had an unexpected ally in Robert Chen, one of the younger engineers who'd been assigned to the project, a quiet man who actually listened to her explanations and seemed genuinely interested in whether the system could work. Chen helped her translate her sketches and notes into proper technical drawings, walking her through the engineering requirements and helping her understand the load calculations and electrical specifications that would make the conveyor system functional, and gradually they developed a working relationship that transcended the usual hierarchy between engineers and floor workers. The installation process was brutal, requiring them to shut down Assembly Line C entirely for 2 weeks while the machinery was installed, and every day of downtime meant ammunition that wasn't being produced, shells that wouldn't reach the front lines, and pressure from Morrison and the War Production Board to get the line operational as quickly as possible. Margaret watched the installation crew work, men covered in grease and sawdust bolting the conveyor framework into place, electricians running power lines, welders joining steel beams with showers of sparks that lit up the factory floor like artificial stars. She designed the conveyor to run at variable speeds, allowing supervisors to adjust the pace based on which station was the bottleneck, and Chen had added safety features that would stop the entire line if someone's hand got too close to the moving part, because the last thing they needed was injuries to compound their problems. The other factory workers watched the installation with mixed feelings, some excited about the potential for easier work, others worried that increased efficiency would mean layoffs or higher quotas that would make their jobs harder, rather than easier. Margaret tried to address their concerns during breaks, explaining that the goal wasn't to eliminate jobs but to maximize output with the existing workforce, that every additional shell they produced meant better support for the troops overseas, but she could see the skepticism in their eyes. The historical knowledge that whenever management promised something would make workers' lives easier, it usually meant something else entirely. Dottie had been transferred to Line C as one of the test workers, and she reported that morale was low, that people were nervous about learning a new system and worried about being blamed if it didn't work, and Margaret realized that the technical challenges were only half the battle, and that getting workers to trust and embrace the new process would be just as critical as making sure the machinery functioned properly. The installation was completed on a Friday night, the conveyor system gleaming under the factory light, looking both impressive and slightly intimidating as it stretched from the stamping area all the way through to final inspection, a continuous loop of steel and rubber that would either vindicate Margaret's vision or prove that she'd been naive to think a factory worker could improve on professional engineering. They ran the first test on Saturday morning with just the installation crew and engineers present and checking that the motors worked, that the belt moved smoothly, that the speed controls functioned as designed, and Chen spent 2 hours making adjustments to the tension and alignment before declaring the system mechanically sound. The real test would come Monday morning when they brought in the Line C workers and tried to run an actual production shift, and Margaret spent the weekend alternating between excitement and dread, unable to sleep more than a few hours, her mind running through everything that could possibly go wrong. Monday arrived with grey skies and rain that drummed against the factory's roof, and Margaret showed up an hour early to find Chen already there, making final adjustments to the conveyor controls, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of Morrison arrived with Harrington and several other managers, and his expression made it clear that he expected this entire experiment to fail spectacularly, that he was only there to document the disaster so he could report back to Washington that they'd tried and it hadn't worked. The Line C workers filed in, 42 women who'd been trained over the weekend on the new system, their faces showing various degrees of confidence and concern, and Margaret gathered them before the shift started, giving them a pep talk about how they were pioneers, how what they learned today could change production across every war factory in America, how their work mattered more than they could possibly imagine. Then the whistle blew, the conveyor system hummed to life, and Assembly Line C began its first official production run with Margaret's design, and everyone held their breath waiting to see if genius or disaster would emerge from the next 8 hours. The system worked perfectly for exactly 47 minutes, and then everything went catastrophically wrong. Margaret had been watching from the supervisor's platform, taking notes on the flow and timing, feeling a growing sense of vindication as she watched the workers settle into their rhythm, the casings moving smoothly along the belt, while hands worked with increasing confidence, when suddenly the conveyor lurched, made a grinding sound that set her teeth on edge, and came to a complete stop with shell casings scattered along its length, like brass evidence of failure. The Line C workers stepped back from their stations, unsure what to do, and Harrington's voice cut through the factory noise with something that sounded uncomfortably close to satisfaction, announcing that this was exactly the kind of mechanical failure he'd predicted, that complex systems were prone to breakdowns, and that they should shut down the test and return to the proven manual process before they fell further behind on production quotas. Margaret was down the stairs and at the conveyor before anyone could stop her, examining the motor assembly where the grinding sound had originated, and she could see that one of the drive belts had jumped its pulley, probably due to tension issues that hadn't been apparent during the test run. Chen was beside her within seconds, his face pale, and together they worked to diagnose the problem while Morrison and the other managers stood in a cluster discussing whether to abort the entire experiment. The workers waited in an uncomfortable silence, and Margaret could feel their confidence evaporating, could sense them thinking that maybe the old way was better after all, that trying to change a system that worked even if it was slow was asking for trouble. Chen identified the problem as improper tensioning on the secondary drive belt, something that should have been caught during installation but had slipped through because they'd been rushing to meet the Monday morning deadline, and he said they could fix it in about 30 minutes if they could get the right tools from the maintenance shop, but 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours given the mood in the room, and Harrington was already drafting his failure report in his head, and Morrison was checking his watch and calculating how much production time they'd lost, and Margaret felt the weight of everyone's expectations and doubts crushing down on her as she realized that one mechanical hiccup might be enough to kill the entire project. She made a decision in that moment, one that was either brave or foolish, and she called out to the Line C workers asking if they could run the system manually for half an hour while they fixed the belt, literally pushing the conveyor along with their hands to keep the casings moving, while Chen and she worked on the repair. The women looked at each other uncertainly, then Dottie stepped forward and said she was willing to try, and one by one the others joined her, and what followed was probably the strangest production method ever seen in an ammunition factory, with workers manually pushing the conveyor belt along its track while simultaneously performing their assembly tasks, their bodies providing the motive power that the motor was supposed to supply. It was slow and awkward and probably violated several safety regulations, but it kept the line moving while Margaret and Chen worked frantically on the motor assembly, their hands covered in grease, tools scattered around them, the pressure of dozens of eyes watching their every move. Harrington complained that this wasn't a proper test, that manual operation defeated the entire purpose of the conveyor system, but Morrison surprised everyone by telling him to shut up and let them work, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something in the plant manager's expression that might have been respect or at least a willingness to see this through before admitting defeat. The belt repair took 26 minutes, every one of which felt like an hour, and when Chen finally tightened the last bolt and gave her a thumbs up, Margaret held her breath as they restarted the motor, half expecting another catastrophic failure, but the conveyor hummed to life smoothly, the drive belt turning properly, the system working exactly as designed. The Line C workers stepped back from their manual pushing and returned to their stations, and within 5 minutes they'd regained their rhythm, working in harmony with the machine, and Margaret watched the production counter clicking upward, tracking shells completed per hour, and even accounting for the downtime. They were still ahead of where a manual line would have been at this point in the shift, but the crisis wasn't over, because problems kept emerging throughout that first day. Of small issues that individually weren't catastrophic, but collectively threatened to derail the entire project, a jam at Station 7 where casings were getting stuck because the spacing wasn't quite right, a bottleneck at the powder filling station where the conveyor was moving faster than the workers could comfortably maintain, and a near miss when one worker's sleeve got caught on a moving part and Chen had to hit the emergency stop before she got pulled into the machine. Each problem required troubleshooting, adjustment, sometimes stopping the line completely while they figured out solutions, and with every stoppage Margaret could see Harrington's confidence growing, see him taking notes for his inevitable report about why this system was fundamentally flawed. The worst moment came at 3 p.m. when the conveyor motor overheated and shut down automatically, triggered by a thermal safety that Chen had installed, and this time the problem wasn't a simple fix because they had to wait for the motor to cool before they could restart, which meant at least an hour of downtime, which meant falling behind production quotas in a way that would be impossible to defend. Margaret sat on the factory floor next to the still-warm motor, exhausted and covered in grease, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she wondered if maybe Harrington was right, maybe this was too complicated, maybe the old system was better, because at least it was predictable even if it was slow. Dottie found her there, and sat down beside her, not saying anything at first, just sitting in solidarity, and finally she pointed out that they'd actually produced more shells in 5 hours with the new system, including all the downtime, than they would have produced in 8 hours with the old method, and that every problem they'd encountered today was something they could fix, something they could learn from. The other Line C workers gathered around, and instead of complaining about the difficulties they started offering suggestions about how to improve the workflow, how to adjust station spacing, how to modify their techniques to work better with the conveyor speed. And Margaret realized that something important had happened during this chaotic first shift. The workers had stopped seeing the system as something imposed on them, and started seeing it as something they were building together, something they had ownership of. When the motor finally cooled and Chen cleared it to restart, the evening shift was arriving, and Morrison made the call to continue running Line C through the night shift while they worked out the bugs, and Harrington objected but was overruled, and Margaret stayed at the factory past her shift change to help train the evening crew on the new system, to share the lessons learned from the day's disasters. The night shift ran smoother than the day's shift had, partly because they'd fixed several of the recurring problems, partly because the new workers approached the system without the day crew's accumulated frustration, and by midnight when Margaret finally dragged herself to the bus stop, Line C had produced 3,847 shells, which was 63% more than any manual line had ever produced in a single day. And despite all the problems, despite the crisis and the doubts and the moments of despair, the numbers didn't lie about what was possible when you were willing to push past comfortable mediocrity towards something better. 3 months after Line C's chaotic first day, the Allegheny Munitions Plant was running 7 assembly lines, with Margaret's conveyor system, and production numbers had increased by 78% compared to the same period the previous year, numbers that had caught the attention not just of the War Production Board, but of military brass and government officials, who were now touring the facility to see the revolution in action. Margaret stood in Morrison's office, no longer wearing greasy coveralls, but a clean factory uniform that had been provided specifically for these official visits, and she still wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention, with reporters asking her questions and photographers wanting to take her picture, with the sudden transformation from anonymous factory worker to someone whose idea was being implemented in war factories across the country. Inspector Collins had returned twice since his initial visit, the first time to document the successful pilot program, and the second time to present Margaret with a War Production Board commendation, a certificate with her name embossed in gold, that she'd sent to her mother because she didn't know what else to do with it. The engineers who'd opposed her had gone quiet, even Harrington, who'd submitted a detailed analysis of the system's performance that grudgingly acknowledged its effectiveness while claiming credit for various optimizations that made it work, which Margaret didn't particularly care about, because the important thing was that soldiers were getting ammunition faster. Robert Chen had become something like a friend, helping her navigate the suddenly complex world of technical documentation and patent application, because it turned out that her conveyor system design was novel enough to potentially warrant intellectual property protection, though Margaret was more interested in seeing it widely implemented than in profiting from it. The factory floor had transformed in ways beyond just the machinery, with workers who'd initially been skeptical, now taking pride in their increased output, swapping tips about how to maximize efficiency at their stations, some of them coming up with their own modifications and improvements that Chen was incorporating into the next generation of conveyor lines. Dottie had been promoted to line supervisor, one of the first women to hold that position at Allegheny, and she ran her crew with a combination of toughness and empathy that got results without breaking spirits. The broader impact was harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. Margaret had received letters from workers at other factories where the system was being implemented, thanking her for making their jobs easier, telling her about production increases that meant their husbands and sons and brothers would be better supplied, and those letters meant more to her than any official commendation, because they represented real people whose lives were affected by what she'd done. Morrison had been transformed too, though he'd never explicitly apologized for initially dismissing her, instead offering her a position as a production consultant with a significant pay increase and responsibilities that went far beyond her original assembly line job. The offer had been tempting, but Margaret had turned it down, at least for now, preferring to stay on the factory floor where she could see the direct results of her work, where she remained connected to the women who'd supported her through the implementation crisis. The pinnacle of her unexpected journey came on a cold morning in December, when a convoy of Army vehicles arrived at the plant, carrying General Douglas MacArthur himself, who was touring domestic production facilities during a brief stateside visit, and Morrison was practically vibrating with anxiety about impressing the general, while Margaret just wanted to get through the visit without embarrassing herself. MacArthur walked the production lines with his trademark corncob pipe and aviator sunglasses, asking pointed questions about output and efficiency, and when Morrison introduced Margaret as the woman whose innovation had revolutionized the factory's production capacity, the general studied her for a long moment before asking if she understood how many lives her idea had saved. Margaret admitted she couldn't really comprehend the scope of that impact, and MacArthur told her that ammunition shortages had been critical in several Pacific campaigns, that there had been battles where victory came down to which side ran out of bullets first, and that the increased production from factories like this one had tipped the balance in ways that would probably never make it into official histories but mattered enormously to the men doing the fighting. He pinned a medal on her uniform, something official that she later learned was rarely given to civilians, and he told her that the Army's gratitude was real, even if it could never be adequate, and Margaret felt tears threatening but held them back because she refused to cry in front of a four-star general. The ceremony ended with photographs and handshakes and reporters scribbling notes, and Margaret endured it all with what she hoped was dignity, and when the general's convoy finally departed, she returned to her station on lines, back to the familiar rhythm of shell casings moving past on the conveyor belt, her hands performing the inspection tasks that she'd done thousands of times before. Dottie caught her eye from across the line and grinned, and Margaret grinned back, and they worked through their shift like always, because wars weren't won by generals and medals and newspaper headlines. They were won by ordinary people doing their jobs well, by workers who refused to accept that good enough was actually good enough when better was possible, by factory girls who saw problems and couldn't rest until they'd figured out solutions, and by the accumulated small victories of countless individuals choosing to care about their work even when nobody was watching or applauding or pinning medals on their uniform. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March 1943, forwarded through military postal channels with stamps from half a dozen countries and water stains that suggested it had traveled through weather and circumstances that Margaret didn't want to imagine. She recognized Robert's handwriting immediately, the careful script he'd learned in Catholic school somehow surviving the chaos of war, and she took her break early, heading to the far corner of the factory break room where she could read in relative privacy. The envelope was thin, just a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and Margaret's hands shook slightly as she unfolded it, bracing herself for news, good or bad or something in between. Robert wrote that he was safe, currently stationed somewhere he couldn't name for security reasons, and that the fighting had been intense, but his unit had come through relatively intact. And then he wrote about ammunition, about how supplies had been irregular for months, about how there had been times when they'd been rationing bullets, counting shots, and how that changed everything about how you approached combat. He described a battle where they'd been pinned down for 6 hours, watching their ammunition counts drop, knowing that if they didn't get resupplied soon they'd have to either retreat or try to hold position with empty rifles. And then he wrote about how supplies finally arrived, crates and crates of shells and bullets and grenades, more than they'd seen in months, and one of the officers mentioned that production had increased dramatically back home, that somebody had figured out how to make factories work better. Robert wrote that he didn't know if the ammunition they received that day had come from Margaret's factory, didn't know if her conveyor system had anything to do with why they had bullets when they needed them, but he wanted her to know that whatever she was doing back home mattered, that the work of factory workers was just as important as the work of soldiers, and that he loved her and missed her and couldn't wait to come home. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away, and she thought about all the arguments and doubts and crises that had surrounded the implementation of the conveyor system, and how abstract it had all seemed sometimes, just numbers on production reports and casings moving along bell, until this moment when it became real in the most personal way possible. Dottie found her there and sat down, without asking questions, just putting an arm around her shoulders in silent support, and gradually other women from Line C gathered, not crowding but present, a community of workers who understood what it meant to have loved ones overseas, who knew that every shell they produced might be the one that kept someone's husband or son or brother alive. Margaret eventually composed herself enough to share what Robert had written, the part about ammunition shortages and resupply, and the women listened with expressions that ranged from grim satisfaction to renewed determination, because this was why they worked double shifts, why they pushed through exhaustion and sore feet and the repetitive monotony of assembly line work, because it mattered in ways that sometimes seemed theoretical but were actually desperately concrete. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, Margaret's hands working automatically while her mind stayed with Robert's letter, with the image of soldiers counting bullets and hoping for resupply, with the knowledge that the work she did in this factory, the innovations she'd fought for, the systems she'd helped implement, all of it connected directly to keeping people alive. When the shift ended and Margaret walked to the bus stop through streets now familiar after 18 months of this routine, she carried Robert's letter in her pocket, the paper worn soft from repeated reading, and she thought about how war revealed connections between people who would never meet, how a factory worker in Pittsburgh and a soldier in Europe were linked by shell casings moving along a conveyor belt, how small improvements multiplied across thousands of units could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. The bus ride home took her through neighborhoods where other factory workers lived, past recruitment posters and ration board offices, through a city transformed by war into something urgent and purposeful, and Margaret looked at all of it with new eyes, seeing not just the surface details, but the invisible web of connections that bound everyone together in a collective effort that was bigger than any individual contribution but made up entirely of individual contributions. She thought about the women on line, about Chen and Morrison and even Harrington, about Inspector Collins and General MacArthur, about the thousands of workers in hundreds of factories across the country, all of them part of a vast machine that was fighting a war on 2 fronts while simultaneously trying to preserve something worth fighting for, and she wondered if they understood how important they were, how their daily work added up to something historic. Margaret arrived at her boarding house as the sun was setting, painting the Pittsburgh sky in shades of orange and purple, and she went to her room and carefully placed Robert's letter in the small wooden box where she kept important things, next to their wedding photograph and the medal from MacArthur and the first production report showing Line C's increased output. Then she sat at her desk and wrote a response, telling him about the factory and the conveyor system, and how his letter had made everything feel more real, more connected, telling him to stay safe and come home soon, telling him that she loved him and was proud of him, and that they were all working as hard as they could to make sure he and his fellow soldiers had what they needed. She sealed the letter and addressed it to his military postal number, knowing it would take weeks or maybe months to reach him, knowing that by the time he read it circumstances might have changed, but sending it anyway because connection mattered, because letting people know they were thought of and cared about mattered, because in a world of violence and uncertainty and fear, the small acts of love and communication were what kept everyone human. The next morning Margaret returned to the factory, to Line C and the conveyor system that now ran smoothly enough that it seemed ordinary, unremarkable, just the way things were, and instead of the revolutionary innovation it had been 6 months earlier, and she took her position at Station 47 and watched the shell casings move past, each one representing a small victory against chaos, a tiny contribution to something larger than herself, a tangible expression of hope that better days were coming, and that the people she loved would live to see. By the summer of 1943, Margaret's conveyor system had been implemented in 47 war factories across 18 states, and the cumulative impact on ammunition production was exactly the kind of story that the War Department wanted to publicize, proof that American innovation and ingenuity were weapons as powerful as any gun or bomb. Margaret found herself reluctantly famous, featured in newsreels and magazine articles with titles like "The Factory Girl Who Changed the War," and "How One Woman's Idea Armed the Allies." And while she appreciated the recognition in theory, in practice it meant constant interruptions to her work, and an uncomfortable level of public attention that made her want to hide in the factory's darkest corners. The government organized a war bonds tour where Margaret and several other civilian innovators traveled to different cities, giving speeches about the home front effort, and she discovered that she hated public speaking with a passion that almost matched her love of solving production problems, but she did it anyway because they told her it was her duty, and because the money raised from war bond sales would fund more of the war effort. In Cincinnati, she spoke to a crowd of 5,000 people at a baseball stadium, and in Philadelphia she met with women's groups who wanted to know how they could contribute, and in Chicago a reporter asked her if she was worried about taking jobs away from men who'd returned from war, expecting their factory positions back, and Margaret had responded that increased production meant more jobs for everyone, and that the idea men-owned factory work was outdated, thinking that the war had already disproven. The tour exhausted her, all the travel and speeches and photo opportunities, but it also showed her how her idea had spread far beyond Allegheny Munitions, how workers at other factories had taken the basic concept and adapted it to their specific needs, adding innovations of their own, creating a second generation of conveyor systems that were even more efficient than her original design. She met with engineers from Ford and General Electric who were applying similar principles to tank and aircraft production, and with War Production Board officials who talked about how systematic efficiency improvements across all manufacturing sectors could give the Allies a decisive material advantage. The numbers backed up their optimism. American factories were now producing ammunition at rates that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan, overwhelming the Axis powers with sheer volume. And while strategy and tactics and soldier courage would ultimately determine who won the war, having enough bullets to fight with was the foundation everything else was built on. Margaret returned to Pittsburgh and to Allegheny Munitions with relief, grateful to escape the spotlight and return to the concrete problems of production. But the factory she came back to had changed in her absence, grown larger and more complex, with 3 new production buildings and workforce that had swelled to over 5,000 people working around the clock. Morrison had been promoted to regional director, overseeing multiple facilities, and his replacement as plant manager was a younger man named Davidson who'd actually served in the army before being reassigned to war production, and he approached the job with military efficiency and a respect for input from workers that was rare in management. Davidson pulled Margaret into planning meetings, asking her opinion on everything from layout optimization to worker training program, and gradually she found herself taking on more responsibilities that went beyond her official title, becoming something like an unofficial consultant on production efficiency. Chen had been promoted to chief engineer, replacing Harrington who'd retired with surprising grace, and together Margaret and Chen formed an effective team, her practical understanding of factory floor dynamics combined with his technical expertise, creating solutions that neither could have developed alone. They worked on a new project designing a modular conveyor system that could be quickly installed in existing factories without requiring complete retooling, something that would allow smaller facilities to adopt the efficiency improvements without massive capital investment. And the project consumed their evenings and weekends with the same intensity that the original conveyor design had. The war ground on through 1943 and into 1944. The news from overseas showing slow but steady Allied progress, and Margaret tracked it all through letters from Rob, now coming more regularly, telling her about the advance through Italy, and the preparations for something big that he couldn't discuss, but that everyone knew was coming. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 happened with the massive material support that factories like Allegheny had made possible. waves of soldiers landing on beaches with enough ammunition to sustain extended combat, and Margaret watched the newsreels showing the invasion footage, and wondered how many of those bullets had traveled along conveyor belts she'd designed, how many soldiers owed their lives to efficiency improvements made by people they'd never meet. The connections between front lines and factory floors had become clearer to everyone, with soldiers sending thank you letters to specific factories, with officers visiting production facilities to explain exactly how the ammunition was being used, with a growing recognition that modern war was as much about industrial capacity as about military prowess. Margaret received a letter from a soldier she didn't know, someone from Robert's unit who'd gotten her name from him, thanking her for the work she'd done, telling her about how adequate supplies had changed their tactical options, given them confidence to take risks they couldn't have taken if they were counting bullets. The letter writer mentioned that Robert talked about her often, that he was proud of what she'd accomplished, that he bragged to anyone who'd listen about his wife who'd revolutionized ammunition production. Margaret felt her throat tighten, reading those words, because it had been 18 months since she'd seen Robert in person, and sometimes the distance felt unbearable, but the work continued, the factory ran, the conveyor belts moved. The shell casings flowed through stations where workers performed their tasks with practiced efficiency, and every completed crate of ammunition represented another small victory in a war that would be won through the accumulated efforts of millions of people doing jobs that ranged from heroic to mundane. Margaret stood on the supervisor platform overlooking Line C one evening, as the sun set through the factory's western windows, and she watched the workers below, their hands moving in synchronization with the machine, and she thought about how far they'd all come from that first chaotic day, when the system had broken down and everything seemed impossible. The conveyor hummed steadily, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, and Margaret allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, oh, not pride exactly, but acknowledgement that she'd seen a problem and refused to accept it, that she'd pushed past dismissal and doubt and mechanical failure to create something that mattered, that the girl who'd started out inspecting shell casings one at a time had somehow become part of something much larger than herself, part of the vast machinery of war production that was grinding the Axis powers down through superior logistics and manufacturing capacity. The shift change whistle blew, the evening crew arriving to take over from the day crew, and Margaret checked the production numbers one more time, noting with satisfaction that they'd exceeded quota again, that Line C alone had produced each one a small act of defiance against tyranny, each one a tangible expression of hope that this war would end with freedom victorious, and that people like Robert would come home to a country worth the sacrifices they'd made.